Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch by interviewing authors, discussing their books, learning about the writing process, and even, on occasion, chatting live with a panel of authors to discuss topics relevant to both readers and writers. My guest today on the Online for Authors podcast is Meredith Ritchie, author of the book Poster Girls. When her triplets left for college, she wrote Poster Girls as a cure for acute empty nest syndrome. In my book review, I stated that Meredith tells a delightful story about a group of Rosie the Riveters working in a bullet factory in Charlotte, North Carolina during World War II. The story comes from 2 points of view, Maggie and Cora. Both women are married to soldiers, have moved to Charlotte from other areas, and love books, enough to start a friendship. However, others aren't quite as keen to see this relationship since Maggie is a white woman of privilege and Cora is a poor black woman. These 2 women are strong and fight for themselves and for one another. I enjoy how Meredith shows how, despite her good intentions, Maggie often gets it wrong. I also love how she shows that Cora, who interprets life through a lens of racism, also gets it wrong. Most importantly, I love how the 2 characters persevere despite it all. If you love a good historical fiction, especially one that makes you think about issues we face today, then this is the book for you. Welcome to Online for Authors, where today I'm talking with Meredith Ritchie, author of Poster Girls. Welcome, Meredith.
Hi.
I am so excited to have you. Loved the book.
Oh, thank you.
Loved the book. But before we get into it too much, let's go ahead and give our listeners an idea of what is Poster Girls about.
Okay, sure. It is if you had to boil it down, I mean, the genre is historical fiction, which is always my go-to reading genre. I just adore it. So I knew that was the type of book I wanted to write. But if you had to boil it down, I'd say it's a women's empowerment story. It's using history to kind of teach us what we forgot and what we could relearn even in this modern setting. So
fantastic. So you said why historical fiction? Because that is your kind of go-to read.
I love it. I wasn't a very good history student in high school and college. I just kind of memorized things for the test. And so I love the power of story. And it really helps me learn history and helps it kind of stick in my head. So.
Right. So what made you set this in World War II versus, a variety of other historical fiction options?
Yeah, well, I couldn't answer the question for myself of how do women lead? How is that typically done? And in fact, when I first got the idea, I really couldn't answer that for myself. And so I wanted to explore that in the book. In order to do that, I sort of needed the men to be gone for a little bit.
Right. So that women could, right?
Yeah, so they could explore that, right? It was really hard when they were around. And they complicate things. I mean, it's not a bad thing. It just is different.
It's just a different thing, right?
It was a different time, and it was a unique circumstance in the history of this country. So they say when you're writing your first book, pick what you know. And so I definitely knew I wanted to write it in Charlotte because I was born here. But I also knew that I needed it to be in that time period. So
right. Well, that's really cool. So now it is in Charlotte with the book, Charlotte, North Carolina. And I think it's great that you were born there. I didn't realize we were both North Carolinians.
Yes.
And I want to know, this is something I did not realize. Was there really a munitions plant in Charlotte in World War II?
That no one knew about or knows about. I guess they knew about it at the time. It was huge. It employed up to 10,000 people, and Charlotte only had about 100,000. So that's 10%.
10% of the workforce right there. Yeah. And then when you say 100,000, half of those were gone to war.
Yeah, could be. Yeah.
I mean,
So, even a bigger percentage of the people.
Right.
It did pull from a lot of other smaller towns.
Smaller towns. Right.
So,
right.
So.
So no, I had not heard about that. So that was a little piece of history, World War
Yeah,
II history. And I love World War II. I too have a World War II book. And
nice.
so I like finding those little tidbits of history that, as much as I've read about World War II, especially in historical fiction novels, I
Exactly.
love it when it's like, oh, I didn't know that. And I didn't know that.
I always say the best compliment I can give a historical fiction author is I was up at 2 o'clock in the morning down a Google rabbit hole trying to figure out how I missed this. Like, how
Yes,
in the world did this happen? And I didn't
I
realize.
didn't even know that this was a
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
right. Um, yeah, so I think that's great. I love that you said it in some place that you know.
yeah.
What made you decide that Maggie, who is the main character,
Mhm.
one of the main characters,
One of
there's
them,
Maggie and Clara.
yeah.
Why did you make her an outsider? She came from Boston. So immediately in that period of time in North Carolina, she was a Yankee and,
Yeah.
persona non grata. She was not,
Yeah. Not to say she wasn't welcomed by,
right,
all people, but she certainly was a little puzzling, at least at first.
right.
So, well, the other thing, with Right Witch, my father was from Boston, and my mother
Okay.
was born in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. So I sort of flipped that one. So
But you understood that dynamic.
I understood that dynamic. And I understood
Right.
that when my dad married my mom, he took her to Massachusetts. So there's this very Southern woman that gets put into Boston. So I sort of flipped the story, but I
Right.
have a lot of stories from my mom about being in I mean, at that point it was Amherst, Massachusetts, and she's just sounded very weird, and people were constantly saying, that to her, and she did feel like an outsider. So,
Right. Right. Well, what's interesting is I say I'm a North Carolinian. I actually was born in Athens, Greece, lived in Ohio, and moved to North Carolina when I was 15. But
okay,
at 60, I've been here a long time, and this is now my home, right?
yeah,
But when I first came to North Carolina, even in 1979,
mhm,
so, years and years after that, I was an oddity.
yeah, yeah,
And people looked at me weird, and I didn't understand 2/3 of what was being said to me. And I
yeah.
just was like, whoa, what
It
is
is.
going on? It was just a very, like a culture shock.
Right. And I
Yeah.
think, and I also was a hybrid. I had a stint in Indiana, a long stint
Okay.
living in Indiana. So I was born here, and then I moved back after many years.
Right.
So, I think a hybrid existence or upbringing, we're all mutts, right?
Right.
So, and
Right.
I sort of at our core. And so I wanted to explore that as well. So,
I loved that. So one of the to me, so there is the women empowerment, but there is also this relationship between Maggie and her friend Clara. Maggie is
it's Cora, actually. Cora.
Cora. That's what I meant. I am so
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah.
I've
Sorry.
got it written down right.
Yeah.
Okay, between Maggie and Cora. And
Mhm.
Maggie is, a white Bostonian who is now living in North Carolina. And Cora is a black, she was from Alabama?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, from Alabama, who's now living in North Carolina.
Mhm.
And the two of them become fast friends.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that is not considered okay by a good number of people who are watching this whole thing happen.
Yeah.
Right? How was it to explore that whole racial tension thing?
Well, I wanted to be true to my core belief, which is that, you know, that's why I sort of when Cora does the speech in the bottom of the church basement, when they're forming that team that's
Mhm.
that's really like half black and half white,
Right.
the all women team that they form. I wanted to say, we can all see the outside of our book, all see the cover of our book, but
Right.
the pages inside that we really want to get to. And that's and when you allow yourself to be shown the inside pages of your own story, and then so allow someone else to see them, and also they do the same, I do believe that friendships like that can form
I
regardless of what your cover looks like. I
I,
did
I
some pushback from editors and things. They're like, I don't know. I don't think they would be friends, or I had to craft it for them to have those opportunities to become friends. And I knew they
right.
were going to bond over books. I mean, that was a given, but but I had to find a place for them to meet, that fits within the historical context.
Right.
And
Right.
and I pushed back on some of the editors, and I said, I don't want to peanut butter history. I don't want to say that, all women were, happy that the war was over, or, no Black people and white people were ever friends. I didn't want to say that it could never happen just because
Right.
that's what the narrative might say.
What I liked was that they are friends,
Mm-hmm.
but they notice their differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they sometimes come up in very awkward ways, because Maggie is a little naive. She grew up in a place where there wasn't as much racism, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe she wasn't aware of it as much.
Sure.
And she comes someplace where it's a little more in your face.
Mm-hmm.
And she often does things where she believes she's being helpful. Look at me, I'm being helpful. And Cora looks at her and says, you have just really, really ruined my day.
Yeah.
You know?
I learned about this concept that I wanted to steer clear of, that some authors do fall into, called the white savior complex.
Right.
So
right.
I wanted to steer as far away from that as I could. But at one point, I think I had Cora with no flaws, and that didn't make any sense either. We're all human, and so it finding that right balance of a character with, or any human, with flaws as well as pluses and minuses was
right. And being able to see that whole person.
Yeah, exactly.
For everything that they were.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that this happens a lot, even today, this idea where, you and someone else become friends, and you think you have all the answers, and you can just make their life so much better. And here's what you should do.
Just
and
listen to me.
Yeah, you just follow my example, right? And
I have all the answers.
Just follow me. And I don't think that people are doing it out of any kind of maliciousness or even any kind of superiority, really. They just really honestly think, if you would just do this without taking into account the other person and the other person's history and background and culture and all the other things that make them who they are. Yeah. And then even just societal bounds and rules that still exist, whether we want them to or not, and all of those things. Yeah. So I got a kick. There were several times where Maggie's doing something and I'm going, oh, Maggie, hun. Cora's not going to be happy with you.
The sweet potato pie chapter was one I was a little bit, nervous to write, because that is where, Maggie's go-to reaction is she just wants to help. So she hears anything like, okay, let's do this and this kind of thing, has the plan. And Cora finally has to tell her, sometimes you just listen and you don't solve anything, and you don't, you don't, by you thinking that you understand, that is, that's almost an insult, to me.
Right. And because you don't. You can't.
You've never lived in my skin. And stop trying to think that you know the answer when you don't even understand the problem. And so just listen. And so it was really, I thought, kind of Maggie to share that feedback with, because she didn't have to, she could have gone on, Cora had a really full life.
She did. She didn't really need Maggie as much as Maggie needed her.
Yeah, exactly. So, but, and then for Maggie to accept that and say, I hear you and I'm trying, kind of thing.
Right.
So, and that's what a friendship is about. So.
Right. Right. It's that push and pull and trying to figure each other out and learn when to say something and when to keep your mouth shut, because, we don't always have those answers. I loved that friendship. Yeah. Yeah. I loved that friendship, because so many times I think it really brings it into focus that as humans, we have that tendency to want to fix
Yeah.
run around and fix. I've got a solution. Let's just follow me. When really maybe listening is all that's necessary.
Yeah.
You know, or really not even necessary, but all that you really, really can or should do.
Right. And listening and validating, like,
yeah,
hear you. And, that must have been awful. And
that must have been
all
awful.
you got to
Right.
say, leave it at that. It's just, for my personality, it's just, it is like just holding myself back, not to say, but what about this? How about,
we can, have you ever thought of?
I know.
Right.
Yes, I know.
Right.
Just,
right. And how, I mean, there's a lot of racial tension in this book, a lot of blatant and not so blatant racism that you see throughout the whole book. How difficult was that balance to make sure that the book didn't tip too far one way or too far the other? Like, it could be too easy to make this book, white people suck and they were horrible racists, every single one of them. And then it could be too much the other way where racism really didn't exist. It was more of a figment. It was more of a figment of Cora's imagination than it was reality. You know what I'm saying? And there's that balance.
Yeah, exactly. So I wrote it. I had the idea right around the Me Too movement. That's why I want to write a women's empowerment story.
Mm-hmm.
And then I wrote it through COVID and then George Floyd. And so some of these topics actually were not, the original intention for the book, but more of my knowledge and awakening of these concepts that I really had not explored,
right.
before that. And that I wanted to use the book to explore. And it was very, it was actually a really good way to do that for me personally.
Right.
So I knew that, I knew that the 30s, in North Carolina would have been, prime Jim Crow era,
right.
and things were, but I didn't want to make assumptions, right? So I remember looking up, like, well, when did the water fountains get separated, and the bathrooms and all that kind of stuff? And it was different time periods than I had originally assumed.
Thought in your mind,
yeah, thought in my mind. But World War II was this weird era. So Franklin Roosevelt published this executive order in 1941 that banned racial discrimination from the defense industry only. So if you've ever seen Hidden Figures, it's how it's how those women worked in NASA.
Okay.
So, yeah, and so before the Civil Rights Act, and so it was a way to Black people and white people had the same entry-level wage for these defense industry jobs. So it was a game changer for many women of all colors. But the reason that Roosevelt published that executive order, even before we had entered the war, was because he knew there's a labor shortage. So it was, well, if there's a labor shortage, then maybe those Jim Crow laws don't quite apply. And we're in this together, we're united. The reason I call it Poster Girls is because there were so many posters were kind of like the social media, back then.
Exactly.
And there were many posters of, we're united together and we can do this together, and Black people and white people working side by side. But it was sort of a necessity. And then as soon as, they fought in a segregated army.
Right.
But they did, allow them to fight. And when they came back, they didn't, a lot of them didn't get GI benefits, to go to college or anything like that. I mean, a very, very small percentage even got that. There was tremendous redlining, after that. So I didn't want to put that in the book, but I wanted the reader to maybe go, I wonder what happened to Cora, and would she have ever gotten that house? And, like, she saved all this money, and what would have happened to that? And what happened to the neighborhood that she lived in? And that was torn down via urban renewal here in Charlotte. So I wanted all readers, but especially my, readers who probably were more like me when I first started writing the book, to come to those conclusions themselves and to understand some of those circumstances they might not have otherwise.
Right. So the black-white issue was different during World War II.
It was, yeah.
The
For
the
a second, and then it went
right, right,
snap.
and the same for female empowerment.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah.
So it was like, look at all of this beautiful stuff.
Yeah.
The war's over. Okay, we're going back to the way it was. All of you pretend none of this ever happened.
Yeah, you can do it. Just kidding. You really want to mop, like
yeah, yeah. You can do it, but not right now. Not anymore. Go on home and raise babies.
You now don't want to do this. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. It was kind of like, it was just enough of a glimpse that to me, I think maybe World War II may have been the beginning of a turning point for a lot of things, because women and then people of color realized, wait a minute, there is more, and I've already proven I can do it.
Right.
And how dare you put a glass ceiling on top of me again?
Exactly.
And now we're going to push, and that's when you started seeing more things going on with women and the people of color moving beyond those bounds and saying, we're not going to be stuck here anymore.
Right.
You can't keep doing this. This isn't where we're going to be. Yeah. I really enjoyed that. Yeah. So shifting gears just a little bit, there's a little bit of like romantic tension between Maggie and her old boyfriend of forever many years.
Yes.
Right? They grew up together. Everyone thought they would marry. And then he had an accident, right? And
yeah, he did, and he sort of blamed her. Yeah,
blamed her, and then that was it for them. And she went off and got married and had 2 children.
And then he didn't blame her for the accident. He blamed her for the distraction.
Right. Yeah. And he couldn't be distracted from his life, and all of a sudden, bam, he shows back up, and her husband is off to war and has been gone now for 2 years, and she's been in this essentially foreign country as far as she's concerned, and there he is.
Yeah.
And all of the old feelings come out. What prompted you to put that piece into the book?
Oh, I mean, you're supposed to throw obstacles. It's your character, right? So that was one of the obstacles that I chose. I chose to explore that also because I'm just a big believer of the yin and yang. No one's all good and no one's all bad.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. And so, we're just not meant to be perfect people. And if we pretend to do that for too long, then, we're going to crack. And so I've always been more like, here's me and here are my flaws. And, I share those with you for the reason of, maybe you understand me better. If you want to share it back with me, that's great. But yeah, I think I'm just kind of over any kind of a perfect, I just don't think it exists. And if it does, I don't trust it at all. So,
right.
So I did want to explore that with her.
What's interesting is the very first manuscript I ever wrote, I had just gotten out of a horrible 14-year emotionally abusive relationship. Like, it was horrible. And I had been wanting to write, and I got out of that relationship, and these words fell out of me, and I'm writing. And that book will never see the light of day because that character is so perfect. 100%, no matter what was thrown at her, she had the right answer at the right time and did the right thing every time. And I think that it was more of a reflection on what I felt I needed to be. Here I was now divorced twice, like nobody likes to say that out loud. That just, I'm now in this horrible camp of,
a lot of people can say it. So we should say it more out loud. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Like, oh, I can't believe I'm going to say that I'm, I'm divorced twice, and that I felt like I had to be this perfect example. And that's what my character was. And when I read it later, it was like, she is so flat and boring.
Yeah.
And I hate her.
Yeah.
And and
No
who,
fun. And I just put her in a drawer.
yes, and who wouldn't hate a character like that?
Well,
And
that's
so,
interesting. So when you were writing it, because I always am writing, I mean, I think it's because of my business writing training, right?
mhm,
You're always supposed to keep your audience in mind as you're writing
right.
it. So I mean, I really did, picture all my characters in a room and pictured, who was going to be reading this, mostly my children and, and family or whatever. Because I thought that's all I was going to read it at first. But I really was writing to somebody, that was like me or that, I thought would benefit from it, some of the lessons that were
I
out there.
think for me, that first manuscript, first of all, I never expected to actually become a published author. I
Mm-hmm.
had no, I had been in this abusive relationship for 14 years. I had zero confidence. I could hardly pick peanut butter on the shelf because I didn't know which brand to pick. I mean, it was pretty bad.
Inside your head, yeah.
Yeah. So I think for me, this was more, I don't know, it was like I needed to recreate me somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And I started out, my character was a late teen. And it was like, I think I was almost going back and saying, okay, this is going to be Terry 2.0,
Oh,
I
wow.
didn't I don't think I had anyone in mind to ever look at it.
Interesting.
But
Yeah.
then when I went back to it, it was like, oh, this is not really a story.
But you're writing it for yourself. And
I
it
think I
does,
was.
I think as authors, we do go back and forth between, because the audience can be yourself for sure.
Right.
And some in journals, that's exactly, or some for a diary, that's exactly who it is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that was, I don't know. It was interesting. I think part of it is you went into it with the idea that you knew that you were going to publish a book. And I went into it with the idea of, I have this story in my head that needs to come out.
Sure. Yeah. Yep.
So it was like a different look at it.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I didn't really believe I was going to be an author for another 3 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it took my husband. So I got remarried. So I'm married 3 times now, people out there in the world. I'm married and I've got it right this
Lucky
time.
me. Yeah.
Yes. But my husband and I did this huge adventure where we rode a tandem bicycle from the coast of Oregon to Washington, D.C.
Right. That's right. I did hear about that. That's so
Okay.
cool.
So at the end of that, I thought, I just rode across the United States on a tandem bicycle. I can do anything, because I am not an athletic woman. This is not like an extension of who I am. I hadn't been on a bicycle. When I met my husband, I hadn't been on a bicycle in 40 years. So it was not like, oh, this is just what Terry always does. And so I thought, well, what do you want? And it was like, I want to be an author.
That's great.
And it wasn't until then that I recognized I can do this. I can be an author. So
and that's the power of a journey too, right?
Yes.
I love that you did a journey. That's a heck of a journey to do. I learned about that in this writing class that I took, and I was like, oh, I want them to go on a journey. So that's really why I put the train journey that they did, in the middle of the book. But yeah, I do believe the power of a journey, and I'm so glad that you, at the end of that, you were like, okay, check the box. I can do that. I can
do anything.
To what I want to do. So that's really cool.
So what was your writing journey like? So you said you were a technical writer. When did you get the bug to be a writer, and when did you know you were going to write a novel?
Well, I knew, my children, I have triplets. So yeah.
This is why we have twins in the book. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I knew how to raise multiples, that kind of thing. And so they were seniors in high school, and I knew that was going to be a really hard personal year for me because, and for them, too, but it was going to be such a busy year, that senior year, and then getting them ready to go to college, and then getting all 3 of them moved into, 3 different campuses in the fall of 2018. And so I was very nervous about that. So it was going to be very busy, and then it was going to be crickets, right? It was going to be very not busy. So I wanted
the whole empty nest thing.
Yeah.
Which by the way is a real thing.
Well, actually I'm in the boomerang phase, so I don't know how.
You don't know how empty it is, but okay.
That's my next book. Yeah. So
Yeah.
emptiness is a lie, but no, I'm just kidding. But I wanted to even out that, the difference between, so busy and then not busy at
Right.
all.
Right.
So I wanted to fill it in sort of with learning something new, because I'm a lifelong learner and I love to do that. So I pretty much just kind of cold called some local authors that I read their books and I liked their books. And, if you call anybody and say, I really liked your work, can I buy you a cup of coffee?
Yeah.
They're usually pretty, happy to do that.
Yeah.
So I did that with 2 local authors, and both of them pointed me in the same direction of a local nonprofit. And I took a year-long Authors Lab course in 2019. That helped me write most of it. And so it was mostly on writing on the weekends. I've always worked full time in between there. So yeah, it was that was my writing, pattern. I wrote early in the morning and I wrote on the weekends. So,
Right.
yeah.
Right. So this was not like a lifelong dream with you as a kid, always knew you were going to be an author or anything like that. This kind of came later, or?
I knew that my dad had written something, and I never actually found, my mom said she read it. So I knew that he had those aspirations. And so I knew that I wanted to explore that. And I'm a good writer, and I've always, writing this sort of something that I'll put off forever. But then once I get into it, I'm so happy that I did it. And so there's very few things, in life that fit in that category, where it's like you don't want to do it, but then you're so happy that you did it.
Right.
Maybe exercise. Exercise is probably very similar. Exercise and reading are right next to each other. Yeah.
Okay.
And accountability, and you need accountability for both, I think. So, and I love a community. So I was really attracted to it from that stance, but I really first went into it because, the main library downtown in Charlotte had all these quotes that were on just the pedestals of the building. Yeah. Yeah. And one of them was by Toni Morrison. And it was like, I wrote my first book because I wanted to read it. And I really felt like, what I had was a good idea, because I'd read a lot of World War II fiction, but it was all based in Europe. I didn't really know what was happening here, on the domestic front. And then I wanted it to be a women's leadership parable. And I remember explaining that to someone at first, and they were like, yeah, don't say that again. That's really boring. But in the end, that's what it is. I want women to be able to read it and go, yeah. So like our differences when we put them together, can actually be our combined strengths. Right. Yeah. Right. And we can accomplish big things. Yeah. So but it's in a different way than, the traditional way that men might do it. So I wanted to explore that. Yeah.
I love that. That's great. I think that literature gives us that opportunity as a reader to experience things that we might not experience otherwise, or to contemplate things that maybe we wouldn't have thought about on our own.
Right.
And you get to do it in the privacy of your own home.
I know. I think it's the only reason, because we're so busy now. There's so many demands on our time. And so for us to choose like leisure time to trade for reading a book, it truly is exactly what you said. It's trying on a different skin.
Right.
And just like, well, how would I react? Here's how the character's reacting. How would I react in that?
How would I feel? What would I do? Do I agree? Do I disagree? Why? Where you start to contemplate. And it's easier in that scenario than, say, face to face with someone where maybe tempers can flare, or you could accidentally say the wrong thing as you're still coming up with where your stance is. And then all of a sudden there's labels and there's all the other stuff. And when you're reading, you get to do all that pretty much alone and in your head. And then maybe you go to a book club and maybe you discuss it a little more out loud, but mostly it's you and this character, and you kind of duke it out in your head and figure out, where do I land in all of this in situations that I'm not going to find myself in.
Yeah.
I
also love the concept of like reading a classic at different parts in your life, you know?
They mean different things.
Yeah, because they mean different things to you, and you relate to different characters within
Right.
it. Someone was, there was an article in the paper about this guy. He was 90 years old, and he read To Kill a Mockingbird every 10 years, and it was a different experience every year. I read another author talking about reading a short story by Eudora Welty. Same thing. You know, when she was a child, she related to the younger character. And
Right.
then when she was older, she was like, yeah, like you could
Yeah.
sit with your grandmother for, you know, it wouldn't kill you to do this.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. All right. When your readers walk away,
Mhm.
you want them to have done or thought what? Where?
I want them to kind of, uh, I want them to project the characters past when the book ends. The book does kind of end a little abruptly, right? It doesn't,
Right.
I mean,
It doesn't wrap up everything. You
it doesn't,
kind of just see the war is over,
right.
and you see people shuffling around trying to move forward, but you haven't really seen any success yet.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, I think there is a tendency for us as humans to think, well, if we can just get to this point,
Yeah.
then everything we'll all be happy, and it'll all be better. And I think that definitely was the case, you know, after World War II. And some things were better, but some things, you know, were worse. And I think at any one point, you know, the reader, and if anything that have learned, you know, from writing this book, it's that, you know, it is what it is. And it's a lot of times it's not the circumstances that make us happy or grateful or content, you know, with what we have. It's a choice that we
Right.
have today. So, you know, I think that Cora knew that for sure. I think she kind of taught, you know, Maggie how to do that,
Mm-hmm.
and not always be, because Maggie, you know, at the beginning of the book was very much, she didn't like change. So all she
Yeah.
wanted to do was go back to her life, you know, in Boston, which was a great life. And but you know, once you're changed, you really can't go back, and that's not a bad thing.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what
Right.
I would like them to kind of know.
Fantastic. So what is next for Meredith Ritchie?
Well, um, so I would love to write a children's book. I have an
Mm-hmm.
idea for that. But I've never done that before, so I need the time to do that, and that's been hard to get with promoting this one and et cetera, and still working. And then my second novel idea is also historical fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and it's based on my husband's family, and it's based in Tombstone, Arizona. So I would like to
Ah.
explore that. Yeah, yeah.
So do you want to give anyone a little preview about that at all? Like what what
It's
era?
Yeah,
Anything?
well, it's the 30s, so it's
Okay.
definitely Tombstone's, you know, not glory years by any means, and but it's also a women's empowerment story. So yeah, and I
Fantastic.
would love to be able to weave in two different time periods in
Okay.
one, yeah, which is
Yeah.
hard to do. So
Yeah.
that's gonna take a while.
Yeah. Um, I did that in An Enemy Like Me, and it is a little tough because you
Yeah.
have to keep up with where are you in both places,
Yes.
and how do you go back and forth without jerking your reader out?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Because you don't want your reader to be in, present day and then, oh, wait, I'm in the 30s, and then, oh, wait, I'm back in present day. You
I
need it
know.
to
Yeah.
feel more flow-like, and it's hard. It's not an easy endeavor, but, you
It's
know,
that's where editors really make the
they
difference. You know,
do.
I think
And it's coming up, I think for you'll find it's coming up with your why. Why do you need 2 time periods?
right, right. Well,
Why is that?
they
Yeah,
have to have so it's like history as a teacher, right? So
right.
you have to be experiencing it's the repetition of how these
Yes.
lessons that we have to learn over time, over and over
Right.
again sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
So
you
you
have to
have
have
to
you have to have a real good reason for seeing it from 2 points of view, and then hang on to that reason as you are transitioning between. That's the main thing, is if you can do that, if you know your why, and then you make sure you stay true to your why, then it won't jerk you around.
Yeah,
But
you're
yeah,
exactly right there, yeah. No, I think understanding the why behind anything that we do.
Oh, absolutely. But when
Yeah.
you make things more complex,
Yeah.
More than one point of view, more than one time period, more than anything, and then so an enemy like me was 3 points of view and 2 time periods.
Whew, yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, and so you had to know your why.
Yeah.
You had to really focus on why am I doing it this way?
Right.
Versus an easy way. Like, I could do this story easier,
Yes. Which is why, Poster Girls is pretty chronological. Like, I was like, I can't write anything, I can't complicate it to that
right.
sense. Yeah.
Right. But it worked well as a chronological. I think that it gave us
everyone's used to the chronology of World War II. Yeah.
Right. And I think too that we saw the growth of these women in a very short period of time. Yep. And I don't know that you would have seen the growth if you kept going to today's world of women and then back to, the 40s women. You would have said, well, they're not growing anywhere. They're just, do you know what I'm saying? It wouldn't have felt the same. Whereas this time you really saw them move forward.
You saw them about 18 months.
Yeah.
From beginning to end. And but I mean, so many things happen in that 18 months.
Yes. Yeah. I also liked Maggie. She had a lot of chutzpah. I don't know what else to call it, but telling her in-laws, I'm going back to work.
Yeah.
My husband's plan did not work.
Yeah. Which,
your son.
He was wrong. And we all do have a need to be right. So, I mean, Maggie was like, and, that it didn't happen to me personally, but it happened to a member of my family. Whereas, the husband just came home and said, I took this job and we're going, did not consult her at all.
Right.
And that was a different time, but it was, I think, done more often than not. Like it didn't even cross their minds to consult or to talk about it to the person that it was going to affect the most. So.
Right. So yeah, I like I said, your characters were very rich. I loved that. You saw growth in these characters. You definitely felt for them.
I wanted every character to have an arc.
Yes.
I wanted Grace to have an arc. I wanted Billy to have an arc. I wanted Owens to have an arc. I love a good story. Even Leland sort of had an arc, although his kind of took a dive there at the end. But even Charlie had an arc.
Right.
I mean, that he was changed, and I didn't realize how brutal the Pacific Theater was in World War II, and how awful it was to not even know where your husband was. You knew he was somewhere in the Pacific, and that was it. So
that was all you knew. There was it isn't like today.
Oh, we're so connected today. Oh my God. I can track my husband right now. Like he's half a mile away, that kind of thing.
I mean, you put them on their phone and you look and you say, oh, there he is, and it's
little picture.
Right. And and it's so different than, and at that time, even if someone wasn't a prisoner, or the mail, getting letters to them, sometimes they would get your letters way out of order because others were lost. Sometimes they never got them at all.
Yeah.
Sometimes they would get them in a bundle. They'd get like 8 at once because they've been being held somewhere. It's very different. Whereas today, even people who are currently, like when they were fighting in Afghanistan and fighting, they could come back to base and do something like this with their family.
True. Yeah. And see their faces and see their expressions.
Right.
That is true.
So it was a very different time where nobody really knew. And, the strength of those women left behind is often not talked about.
Yeah. And I remember trying to picture, like, what if I only had letters, between me and my family? Like, that would be so, so hard. geeked out on the mail a little bit too, because I was fascinated by that. That was the only tie to people that they were married to, or their parent, or their child, or what have you. And so the mail got so heavy, and fuel got so precious that they built, or they invented microfiche. So that was invented by World War II. So that was why they had to have the certain V-mail, this prescripted, letter shape and whatever. And they just took a picture of all the letters and had all that paper was then converted to one roll of film. Then that roll of film went over on the airplane. So much, much lighter and much less fuel,
less space, easier to put in with everything else that they're shipping anyway.
Right. Which is probably why it was done in batches. And then they did like heat transfer printing, I think, when it was over there, to actually reprint the letter as a piece of paper. So, which is crazy. World War II, there was necessity was some other invention for many, many things. So.
Absolutely. All right. So Meredith, if someone wanted to get up with you and wanted to know I want to talk with you, or I want to learn more about you, or I want to keep up with where do they go and how do they do it?
The easiest place is meredithritchie.com. Mm-hmm. So that is where you can go to learn a little bit more about me, but there's a very easy to find contact me page that you can just enter your information on, and it goes right into my email inbox. Fantastic. So I would love to do that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with me today, Meredith.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yes. All right. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.